And just as the rule of thumb over there is that whatever can be worn in the normal fashion, whatever is worn like a coat, you wear as a coat. Whatever is worn as trousers, you wear as trousers. In other words, as long as you wear them in the normal manner, you can wear 3 pairs of trousers and 4 coats if you want, in order and walk out into the street or take it elsewhere, in order to save them from the fire, because you are wearing them in the normal fashion. In the same way, Rabbah says, seeing that normally during the week when you wear tefillin, you wear 1 pair at a time, the same applies here. As long as you do it in the normal fashion, you may wear tefillin to save them on Shabbat, so you wear 1 pair at a time. So Rabbah explains the Tanakama. Nothing to do with Shabbat being Zman tefillin. It has simply to do with the fact that there is always the hashash of a person carrying tefillin on Shabbat, either to save them from disrespect or from danger, from being lost or destroyed, or because he had to remove them because he had to go to the bathroom or some other reason. Or let's say it was a very hot day. He was walking outside in tefillin on Shabbat, and it was very, very hot, and he had to take them off. He wanted to take them off for 10 minutes to cool down. And he may end up carrying them in the street, for example. There's all kinds of reasons why a person may end up carrying tefillin during Shabbat, of course assuming that a person wears tefillin many hours of the day. So Rava explained why the Tanakama said 1 pair at a time, because that is how tefillin are always worn. And what we allow on Shabbat is what you do during the week. And just as if a person's very cold in the middle of winter, he wants to wear 2 sweaters or 2 jackets to keep warm, he may do so. In the same way, we say you may do so on Shabbat to save it from a fire. And in the same way, we say regarding tefillin, you wear 1 pair normally on Sundays, Mondays, etc. through Fridays. Bakasha, you can do the same on Shabbat to save them. So the only thing that needs to be explained now is Rabban Gamliel. So why does he say 2? Simple. Rabban Gamliel says the same thing. In fact, in other words, there's no need for any recourse in order to explain this machloket to the idea that Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin according to somebody. No one holds Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin. Not one Tana actually holds such a view. Ela, the Tanakama says you can save them 1 pair at a time because that's what you do during the week. And Rabban Gamliel says that's what you do during the week. But it is also a fact that you can wear 2 pairs of tefillin at a time. And that's a halakha that is also accepted. And there's room for 2 tefillin. So seeing that we say you can wear tefillin in the normal way, and seeing there's room for 2, that's also considered normal. And therefore you can wear 2. So we've just explained the mahloket. Rava, not I, Rabbah explained the mahloket in the Talmud Bavli satisfactorily, without any reference to the notion that Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin according to anybody. Then it's after this explanation of Rabbah has been stated, and Rabbah explained the Tanakama, and then the Gemara went on to add that, and as for Rabban Gamliel who holds 2, then we just have to add this one extra piece of information that one can wear 2 pairs at a time. There's room for 2 at a time, even though one doesn't normally do so, and therefore Rabban Gamliel holds 2 at a time. And then we've explained the whole machloket. Everything from that point on, where the Talmud begins to say, well, really there's a machloket between the Tanakama and Rabban Gamliel about the Shabbat Zman Tefillin, or about when Baal Tosif applies, or whether Baal Tosif applies if it's Zman Tefillin or whether it's not Zman Tefillin. It gets very, very complicated. None of this is actually necessary. And that's exactly what Rabbeinu Yonathan just did. Rabbeinu Yonathan just explained the Rif, entirely based on the explanation of Rabbah and what the Talmud explained about there being room for 2 tefillin, and didn't say a word about Shabbat being Zman Tefillin according to anybody. And this, without a doubt, in my mind certainly, is the correct and straightforward interpretation of this Mishnah and this Mahloket between the Tanakama and Rabban Gamliel. Yes, Bakasha.
The whole argument about Shabbat being Zman Tefillin or not come in. Why is it there? Why instead you can what it's not there?
I understand your question. I'm asking why do we find any such discussion if it's unnecessary? It's a very good question. Because the fact of the matter is that no matter where you look the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael and the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. In all the Baraitot that we have, there's not a single Tana that holds the Shabbat is among Tefillin. And we see that it's possible and actually very simple to explain the Mishnah without reference to any such conception. So why do we need it? It's not very clear why we need it, to be honest. It's really not very clear. And the fact is, Rabbah didn't think it was necessary. Rabbah doesn't think so. Rabbah tells you the reason that Tanakama says you wear one pair at a time is because you wear on Shabbat that which you do during the week as well. That's what you can do on Shabbat because it's considered malbush. It's considered like wearing. Okay, so he just explained the Mishnah. That's why one. Rabban Gamliel wasn't explained by Rabbah. The Talmud added that because there's Machon Shilo Tefillin, so that's what you can do. We've explained the Mishnah. So why do we need anything more? For whatever reason, which is not clear to me, I admit, there were people, there were Chachamim in many generations ago, who wished to find some other explanation or an additional explanation for this mahloket. But really, as we just have seen now, it's really not required, and it just confuses an issue which is really not very complicated at all.
I may have been confused, but when the Rabbeinu Yonathan starts speaking about that the Chachamim made it asur to wear tefillin on Shabbat for certain reasons, is he making the point that it could be a Zman tefillin, or that somebody holds that it is, or is there some other purpose to for which he's saying that?
Well, he's clearly relating to the possibility that someone might claim such a thing. And I would tell you more than that. And I saw this over Shabbat. I saw this in the Chidushim and Perushim of HaGaon Rabbi Levi Ginsburg on the Yerushalmi, which is one of the most amazing books of Perushim and Chidushim that one will ever you will come across. He makes the point that really, and I'm about to show you this from the Yerushalmi. He's writing on the Yerushalmi that it's more likely that Minat Torah Shabbat is Zman Tefillin. What does that mean? Minat Torah Shabbat is Zman Tefillin. What does that mean? As I explained in the first shiur on this topic, the rule of thumb is that unless you know for a fact that you do not wear tefillin at a certain time, then you do. Unless you know that you don't, you definitely do. That's as I explained to you. That's how I know that on Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays you have to wear tefillin, because it doesn't say that you don't, and therefore you do. It's only where it says explicitly that I don't, that one does not do, so that I do not. I know that I'm not supposed to wear tefillin at that time. So if it says Shabbat, you don't wear tefillin. Alright, so Shabbat, we don't wear tefillin. If it says Yom Tov, so you don't wear on Yom Tov. If it doesn't say Hol HaMoed, for example, and Hol HaMoed is never included in the term Yom Tov, then it's not included. So you wear on Hol HaMoed. There has to be an explicit statement to the effect that on this day, on this time, you do not wear tefillin. Now regarding tefillin, if you look at the Torah, none of the limudim from the Pesukim mentioned in the Mechilta, or quoted by the Talmud Bavli, none of the limudim from those Pesukim are very convincing. That's what the Pasuk is actually referring to. It's clear that the Peshuto Shel Mikra is referring, the Pasuk Shamata is referring to Korban Pesach. That's the simple pshat of the pasuk. According to, if you look in the Mefarshim on the Torah, you'll see also that's what everybody says the simple pshat is. All of the Mefarshim, Sa'adia Gaon, and Rashi also. Rashi says so, and Ibn Ezra says so. Wherever you look, you'll see this is understood, and this is also how it's explained in the Targum normally associated with Yonathan ben Uziah, which is not Yonathan ben Uziah, but nevertheless it's an ancient Targum, and that's what it says there quite clearly. No, I'm sorry. In that Targum, it says the opposite. In that Targum, it Dafka explains the pasuk to be referring to Tefillin, because that Targum often explains things lo lefi pshat. But in Targum Yonatan and Targum Onkelos, I mean to say, which is much more pshat oriented, it seems clear that it's referring to Korban Pesach, which is of course how it was explained also by many of the Tanaim. So the point that I'm trying to make is this, and the point made by Rabbi Levi Ginsburg is as follows. There are many things in the Torah where the Torah says something, but it doesn't necessarily provide precise instructions. In other words, it says where tefillin. It doesn't say when not to and when you should. So, Minat Torah, you would understand by default that you always wear tefillin, and that's in fact what that would be a correct understanding. For example, just to tell you what does the Rambam say? Just to quote from the Rambam for a moment. In Chot Tefillin, at the beginning of Chot Tefillin, he always lists at the beginning of each section of Miswot. He lists the Miswot from the Torah that he's about to discuss in this section. So in Chot Tefillin Mezuzah v'Sefer Torah, he begins by saying, Yesh bichlalan hamesh misvot aseh. There are 5 misvot aseh in this section. V'zel hu paratan, and these are those 5. What does he write? Lihiyot tefillin ala rosh, to have tefillin on one's head. And the second one, lekoshram ala yad, and to wear them on one's arm. Okay, what does that mean? Always at night, when one's swimming in the sea, when do we know exactly what you do when you don't do? It doesn't say. In other words, the Rambam just says that the Torah says wear tefillin. It doesn't say anything. It just says have tefillin, wear tefillin. When exactly you do, well, when you don't, when you are told to remove them, when you are told not to remove them, that's all in the hands of the Chachamim. Just as, by the way, many Rishonim, some Rishonim, who hold that melacha on Hol HaMoed is asur min Torah. Yerushalmi says explicitly otherwise, but there are those Rishonim who understand that melacha on Hol HaMoed is min Torah. But it was left in the hands of the Chachamim to decide what should be mutar and what should be asur. So, in other words, it's a similar concept, that something may have a basis in the Torah, but it's not given precise delineation, a precise description as to when this applies and when it does not apply, and that is in the hands of the Chachamim to interpret and to apply the Torah halacha l'ma'aseh. When it comes to applying the Torah halacha l'ma'aseh, the Chachamim said, according to this understanding, from the Torah you may understand that you should wear tefillin on Shabbat also, and that may be very reasonable and logical, but we are saying not to wear tefillin on Shabbat for the reason that maybe you'll carry them on Shabbat. We see that, by the way, many things we're told not to do many things on Shabbat, even though they involve the miswah, because of the hashash of carrying them on Shabbat, right? Why don't we read the Megillah on Shabbat? So that people won't carry the Megillah on Shabbat. Why don't we, according to the Talmud Bavli, and Talmud Yerushalmi explains otherwise, why do we not blow the shofar on Shabbat? So the people won't carry the shofar on Shabbat. Of course it's okay to carry your talit and your mahzor to shul, that's of course all right. Just the shofar is a problem. Why do we not, again according to the Talmud Bavli, why do we not have netilat lulav on the first day of Sukkot that falls on Shabbat? Because you may carry the lulav b'shut harabim. According to the Talmud Yerushalmi, you do. On the first day, you just don't carry it. You take it to shul the day before, and you leave it there. You would think a simple, straightforward solution, but that's the fact. The Mishnah states explicitly that you do on the first day, not on Hol HaMoed. At any rate, the point we're making is that there are many things that we're told by the Chachamim not to do, not because the thing itself is asur, but because it may lead to a situation where something is carried on Shabbat. It's not therefore at all far-fetched to say that because of the hashash of carrying on Shabbat, the Chachamim thought it wise not to wear tefillin on Shabbat. That doesn't explain, by the way, why tefillin would not be worn on Yom Tov when you may carry, by the way. Which puts in doubt this whole thesis that Shabbat is Minat Torah, a reasonable time to wear tefillin, but the Chachamim thought it was wiser not to do so. But you could make such a claim simply because the Torah doesn't actually say when you wear tefillin. It just says to wear tefillin.
It doesn't say when you wear tzitzit.
You're right, it doesn't. And that's exactly why you wear it every day of the year. Correct? You don't say we wear tzitzit during the week, not during Shabbat, or not on Hol HaMoed. Why do you not say that? Because there's no basis in the Torah to say such a thing, so you don't say it. So whether it's in fact the case that the question of wearing tefillin on Shabbat, shall we say, is unclear in the Torah, which in fact it is unclear. It's not specifically mentioned. Or whether and the Chachamim didn't actually have a clear tradition that wearing tefillin is not correct on Shabbat. Yet they decided to be gozer against wearing tefillin on Shabbat for the reasons that we mentioned, of carrying perhaps. Or whether the opposite, or the other possibility is the true case, is the true reality, namely that they had a tradition, Torah She'Ba'al Peh, a classic case of Torah She'Ba'al Peh, where they knew that tefillin were not worn on Shabbat and not on Yom Tov, which, by the way, is more easy to explain, because then you can also explain why not Yom Tov. In other words, how do they know this? They were told, a tradition, and they also saw, every generation saw that people weren't wearing tefillin on Shabbat. Everyone came to Shon Shabbat and saw no one was wearing tefillin, and the Chachamim were wearing tefillin. Everyone said this is what you do, so apparently this is what you do. Whether it's the former or the latter, Shabbat, practically speaking, and it doesn't really matter now whether you say it's Minat Torah or not, it doesn't matter, because as we said, really from the Torah, it's really not clear at all. So it's not a case of saying the Torah, even according to the former explanation, that the Chachamim were gozer against wearing tefillin on Shabbat. It's not the case that the Chachamim undid what the Torah says. Because the Torah doesn't say wear tefillin on Shabbat specifically, it just says wear tefillin. So it's something which is left moot in the Torah, and the Chachamim defined more precisely, as is the case with literally hundreds of halachot. The same is true as we mentioned with many other mitzvot. So whether it's the case that the Torah left it moot and the Chachamim defined it and were gozer, or whether it's the case that there was a clear tradition that you do not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And it's even possible, by the way, based on the fact that we see in the Mechilta, that there are some drashot that simply exclude Shabbat but not Yom Tov, that there was a tradition, at least amongst some of the Chachamim, that this halakha of not wearing tefillin applies to Shabbat but not to Yom Tov. In other words, it could be that hold on Yom Tov you do wear tefillin. Also possible.
What about the second day?
No, I'm not. I'm talking now in Eretz Yisrael. There's no second day. I'm talking in a simple case. All right. However we explain it, halakha l'ma'aseh, everyone agrees that Shabbat is lo zaman tefillin. In other words, all the Chachamim agreed that if any Chacham you approached, whether it's Rabbi Yosef Gilili, or Rabbi Akiva, or Rabbi Meir, or Rabbi Yosef, or Rabbi Yehuda, they all tell you, or Rabban Gamliel, they will all tell you the same thing. Should I wear tefillin today? It's Shabbat? No, you shouldn't wear tefillin. So practically speaking, the halakha is, according to all, Shabbat lo zaman tefillin. And we find not one single statement anywhere in amongst the Tanaim that suggests that Shabbat is zaman tefillin. There's no explicit statement to that effect whatsoever. The Talmud Bavli, when trying to explain that there might be such a position, really has to really work very hard to find such an opinion, and doesn't actually find one. And the only reason that Talmud Bavli even began to search for such an opinion was because of this Mishnah, this problematic Mishnah here in Eruvin, as it were, that caused all the trouble. But really, as we explained, there isn't very much trouble here. There's actually no trouble at all. Now, if you look in the Yerushalmi, there's no Yerushalmi here. So if you open up Eruvin Perek Asiri here, we have the same Mishnah, of course, and the Talmud Yerushalmi explains as follows: the very beginning. Hamoset tefillin, machnisam zug zug, Rabban Gamliel omer shnayim shnayim. What does the Talmud Yerushalmi state? המוסה תפילין מכניס המזוכזור דרך מלבוש, אחת בראש ואחת בזרוע, אחת בראשו ואחת בזרועו, as you normally do. רבן גמליאל אומר שניים. It should say as follows: שניים בראש ושניים בזרוע. There's a word שניים missing there. Rabbi Abahu, Rabbi Al-Azar says as follows: Hanothen tefillin balayla. Hanothen means to wear, to put on oneself. Hanothen, that's the term that was usually used, referring to the act of putting on tefillin. Hanothen tefillin, not the word hameniach tefillin. Hanothen tefillin balayla over ba'aseh. Whether you should take this literally or not is also a good question, because and this has a lot to do with, again, with everything we're discussing. How literally do you take everything? In other words, is there room for intellect and reason and other factors that we know of? Is there room for considering whether certain things that are said in a certain way are to be taken literally or not? The answer, I think, is clearly yes. So if it says here that wearing tefillin is over ba'aseh, whether it's really being over ba'aseh, whether it's actually assuming HaTorah to wear tefillin at night or not, that's a matter for some debate. But it does say here not to wear tefillin at night. It's exactly the same discussion, by the way, as Shabbat. Just as I explained a moment ago, that regarding Shabbat one can understand that you can understand from the Torah perhaps one thing or another thing, because it's not really explicit. But it is a fact that all the Chachamim agree you do not wear tefillin on Shabbat. In the same way, we see in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and we see it throughout all the Tanaic literature, that all the Chachamim hold, and in Eretz Yisrael all the Tanaim, all the Amoraim also hold, that Laila is not Zman tefillin, that you do not wear tefillin at night. Again, whether this is actually, in fact, stipulated by the Torah, mandated by the Torah, that one may not do so, one should not do so, or whether this is a gzerah of the Chachamim, because you may fall asleep wearing tefillin, which of course also speaks volumes about what kind of tefillin people wore, because you really can't fall asleep with the kind of tefillin that many people wear nowadays. It would be almost sakanat nefashot to do so.
They sleep on their back.
And people, of course, wore them all the time, and therefore, if you were very tired and you're very small and lightweight, you could lie down and put your head on your pillow and say, I'll rest for 5 minutes. You'd end up falling asleep, and they don't want you to sleep with the tefillin. Whether it's a gzerah or whether it's minat Torah, whether we take the statement that Laila, if you put on tefillin at night, you're over ba'aseh. In other words, you're going against what the pasuk says, because the statement here in the Yerushalmi is Hanothen tefillin balayla over ba'aseh shene'emar b'shamatah hukah hazot l'mu'adha miyamim yamima. Again, this pasuk is being interpreted as referring to tefillin, which is not the pshat. But the statement is that from here we learn that you do not wear tefillin at night. Yamim v'lo leilot, it says in the Yerushalmi. It also should say here another word, which is another line, which is missing here. Yamim, yamima, parat l'shabbatot v'yamim tovim. As we'll see in a moment, this was left out by mistake here. We see this clearly in a moment. So again, it doesn't matter whether you take it literally or whether you think the Torah made this statement explicit or implicit, or whether it's a tradition. The fact is, the halakha is, what you need to know, the bottom line is halakha. Do you wear tefillin at night? No. Do you wear tefillin Shabbat? No. Do you wear tefillin on Yom Tov? No. Any other time, you do, because you weren't told otherwise. The Gemara goes on to ask, the Yerushalmi goes on to ask, we just said that you do not wear tefillin at night. Waha Rabbi Abahu Yathev, Ummafne Baramsha Utfilin Eloi, or Tfiloi Eloi, which means, but we know that Rabbi Abahu was seen sitting in the evening at night, teaching Torah in the evening, and tefillin were on him. So how do we understand this? It says here, Misadavin Hayu Kimin Pikaron Hayu Biyado. That's how it should be. It's a resh, not a dalad. Which means, and whether it's Misadadin or Masorarin Hayu Kimin Pikaron Biyado, it means to say that he wasn't actually wearing them, he was holding them in his hand. In other words, he had removed them, but he had them, he was holding on to them to look after them. If the Ba'imemar, there are those who explain, Lomar Ella Hanothen, that the halacha that said that you do not wear tefillin at night, said only that Hanothen, he who places them on himself at night, that's a sur. But if you were wearing them previously, again, this proves that one wears tefillin all day. If you're wearing them in the afternoon and now it became night, you don't have to remove them. So the fact that Rabbi Abba was sitting teaching Torah and tefillin at night doesn't prove a thing. He was wearing them in the afternoon and he continued teaching. The sun set, the stars came, and he continued teaching and he didn't take them off, but there's no need to take them off. If the ba'e nashmin ada min hada, there are those who say we can learn this from the following. I'm sorry, I skipped a sentence. There are those who explain that you do have to remove tefillin at night, but only later at night. And this was, when Rabbi Abba was doing it, was before that time. In other words, it was the beginning of the evening, and you only have to remove it, which is approximately half an hour or 45 minutes after the sunset. So he was seen wearing tefillin, let's say 15 minutes, 20 minutes after the sunset. And at that time you do not yet need to remove them. It's only when it's fully night and completely dark that you need to remove tefillin. If the ba'id nashmina min hadha wa yulach ala oth, mishasrichim oth, yasu shabbatot yomim tovim, shehen gufan oth. This is the limud that we know of from other places of Rabbi Akiva, that these days are an oth, and you do not wear tefillin on the day which is also called an oth on such a day. Now, the Yerushalmi says something very important here. It says, didn't we just make this statement, learn this fact, this halachic fact earlier from a different pasuk? In other words, now you just brought a source why you do not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov from the pasuk v'hayu lecha la'oth. Previously you brought the same limud, you stated the same halacha based on the pasuk v'shamata hukah azot le'mu'adam yamim yamima. So decide, is it from this pasuk or is it from that pasuk? Now, what would the Talmud Bavli do with such a question? It would give a very involved explanation as to why he's learned from this one, not from that one, or according to the other view from that one, and not from this one. The Yerushalmi says something very simple. It says, in the name of Rabbi Yohanan, Lef lach ela kaida amar Rabbi Yohanan. The only thing you can say is what Rabbi Yohanan said. Kol milad lama hawara. Anything which is, now literally the word mahawara means unclear. That which is unclear. Dalam mahawara. V'samchim le min afrin sagin. We back it up from many places. What is Rabbi Yohanan saying? When you have a halacha, midivrei soferim, in other words, a halacha expressed, stated by the chachamim, not mifurash in the Torah. Certain things are mifurash in the Torah. Machon, don't eat pig. So that's clear. It's not midivrei soferim. But wearing tefillin on Shabbat is vaday midivrei soferim. Even if you want to hold it that it's minat Torah in some way, but the chachamim express this fact. So in many ways, in many contexts, it's referred to as divrei soferim, because without the soferim, you wouldn't know that it's so. What does Rabbi Yohanan say? Something which is, he uses the term dalal mahawara, but what that really means, I'm not going to give all the examples now, but there are many places in the Talmud Yerushalmi where we see this, and this is also pointed out by Rabbi the Chacham I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Levi Ginsburg in his Chidushim. There are many places where we see that in Yerushalmi this expression means basically whether something is considered to be minat Torah or not minat Torah. In other words, if something is clearly written in the pasuk or is clearly implied by the pasuk, then it's considered minat Torah. Then it's called mahawra. It's clear because it says b'furash. If something is not written b'furash or not clearly implied by the Torah, but the Chachamim say so, that's considered la mahawra, not unclear. Unclear in the sense that if you look at the Torah, you can't see it. In order to back up such a statement, the Chachamim would quote different pasukim which can be interpreted, even though it's not lefi apshat, which can be interpreted as in a certain way that would tend to back up this halacha. So Rabbi Yohanan says the reason you have a limud of not regarding not wearing tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov from this pasuk, and the same limud from another pasuk, is because this is a milad ala mahawra. This is something which is not written in the Torah. It's midivrei soferim, and whatever pasuk we can find that has some that in some way indicates this fact, we mention. So in other words, basically we see here something very important, that many limudim, not all, but many limudim in Chazal from pasukim, it's not that the pasuk came first and the halacha came from it. The halacha came first. The pasuk is an asmachta. What's called an asmachta, which means, that's what Yerushalmi is saying. Yerushalmi is saying here that all these pasukim are asmachtaot. In other words, the halacha was known. The chachamim knew again, what the essential source of that halacha is not really material now. The halacha is you do not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and you do not wear tefillin at night. On what pasuk to what pasukim can we attach this? Different opinions were offered by different chachamim. We can learn it perhaps from this pasuk, or we can suggest that pasuk as a source. But really, the halacha is what comes first, and the pasuk is some kind of a backup. But it's not. That's what asmachta means. And asmachta is a backup. The word asmachta is used today in modern Hebrew also in that sense. In other words, some kind of a source or a record of something. In official correspondence and in legal correspondence, etc.
You mean that Torah, the pasuk comes first all the time?
If something is written mufurash in the Torah, it's written mufurash in the Torah. If something is not mufurash, but it's clearly implied by the Torah, for example, the Hol HaMoed, something is written in the Torah that, it's obvious you don't do this. So, if from what it says in the Torah, if it says in the Torah X and Hol HaMoed Y, therefore follows from that, then Y is considered also to be written from the Torah, in the Torah, because it flows inexorably from the Torah. So both those things are considered to be minat Torah. But when something is not either explicit or clearly implicit in what the Torah says, then that halacha is not considered to be minat Torah. Now the Yerushalmi goes on to say a few other things that are very relevant to our discussion. First, it mentions the issue of women wearing tefillin on Shabbat. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it does say here as follows: that there were women. It mentions women that used to wear tefillin, and then it goes on to say that it basically says simply that women may wear tefillin if they wish to. Then it goes on to say, Hawon ba'on perhaps memar al da'athon de Rabbanan en mahawar. Al da'athir de Rabban Gamliel mahawar. Now we just explained a moment ago that the word mahawar, which means clear, in the way that it's used in the Yerushalmi in many sugyot, means that something is clear that it's from the Torah, or is it not clear that it's from the Torah, in which case it's midivrei sofarim. So the Yerushalmi is saying there are those who wish to explain, there were chachamim in Eretz Yisrael who wish to explain that according to the Rabbanan, in other words, the Tanakh Kama, the first opinion of the Mishnah, that you wear one pair at a time. En mahawar. What's en mahawar mean? The fact that you do not wear tefillin on Shabbat is en mahawar. It's not clear. In other words, it's not written in the Torah. It's midivrei sofarim. In fact, it may even be only a gzerah. So therefore, they say you wear one pair at a time, because it may in fact be maybe minat Torah is really zman tefillin. In other words, left to your own devices without the chacham, you may have decided, it would have been reasonable to assume such a thing, perhaps, that you can wear tefillin on Shabbat. So why shouldn't you do it if you find tefillin on Shabbat? Why shouldn't you wear them and bring them in? You can't carry that, we understand, but you can wear them, Machon. So the chachamim perhaps hold that this limud about not wearing tefillin on Shabbat is en mahawar, is not mefurash in the Torah. So therefore it's midivrei sofarim, and therefore it might really be minat Torah, it might be considered zman tefillin. If that's the case, you should wear one pair like any other day where it is zman tefillin. Al da'afeh de Rabban Gamliel mahawar. But according to Rabban Gamliel, this limud is considered mamash minat Torah. In other words, he doesn't think it's an asmachta. He thinks it's really minat Torah, that we really understand from the Torah itself that one does not wear tefillin on Shabbat, and that's why he dafka holds that you can wear two, because it's not zman tefillin. Not because of Baal Tosif, simply because it's not Zman Tefillin, so you're less limited in what you can do in the way you wear it. If it's Zman Tefillin, then you have to wear it like you always wear Tefillin. If it's not Zman Tefillin, it's only there for the purpose of Hatzalah, for saving, for protecting these Tefillin. And then you're allowed to get away with more, because it's not really a Zman of Tefillin Bichlal. And then the Gemara goes on the Yerushalmi goes on to state, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah b'Shem, and then according to Rabbi Levi Ginsburg, we should read here with a Dalet de Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, because as it was explained by Rabbi Yirmiyah b'Shem Rabbi Shmuel, as was explained in the Talmud Bavli, it's explained here also. Shi'aru lomar, it was estimated, and there was a Chachamim state, Ad makom shegov ho sherosh mahzik, v'kama mahzik shtayim. In other words, the part of the head where one wears tefillin can hold two. Me'ata afilu b'hol. So if that's the case, the always question is, so therefore you can also wear two pairs on a weekday if you wish. And what does Yerushalmi say? Not like the Bavli. Amar Rabbi Hagai, en ba'e methav yahavo. If you wish to, you can wear it too. Why you'd want to do it, I don't know. But if you want, says Rabbi Hagai, if you want to wear it too, on Shabbat, when we have tefillin lying in the field or lying on the ground, on Shabbat, and maybe it'll be trodden over, maybe it'll be lost, maybe it'll get wet. All sorts of things can happen at tefillin, or bichal, it's just bizayon. We have a good reason to say, wear two at a time. Bring as many as you can into a protected and mechubad place as quickly as possible. But any other time, there's no reason to wear two. Again, this is a clear proof against the Ori about wearing two pairs of tefillin simultaneously. But Rabbi Hagai says, Yachinami, if you wish to wear two pairs on a Wednesday or a Monday morning, b'vakasha, no problem. It's not, in other words, it's not Baal Tosif. Not like the Talmud Bavli at least was Choshesh, that maybe it's Baal Tosif involved in wearing two pairs of tefillin at the one time. According to Yerushalmi, there's no such problem b'chlal. There's no such inyan. According to the Tanakama. Why? Because if we say, according to Rabbanan, en mahwar, which means that it's not at all clear that it's really the case that minat Torah you don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. It might be something which was decided by the Chachamim. So therefore, it's a legitimate time for wearing tefillin according to the Torah, and therefore you must act today when there's a mitzvah to wear tefillin as you would any other day of the week. You must wear one pair at a time and not more, because the heter for wearing tefillin on Shabbat was to wear it as you normally wear it in order to save it, as you normally do when it's a mitzvah to wear tefillin. And today may also be such a mitzvah.
Even though Rabbi is saying on a normal day,
you could if you wanted to, but you don't. No one does. Technically, you want to do it. You want to do strange things. Be strange. There's no mitzvah. There's no isur to be strange.
You can't be strange to save the.
That's exactly the point. You can be strange to save tefillin on Shabbat, but normally you wouldn't do this. But to save tefillin on Shabbat, you can do strange things. A strange thing. It's a strange thing to wear two tefillin on Shabbat.
Like three coats.
To wear two tefillin bichlal. It's strange. On Shabbat, we allow it for the reason that we explained.
That's Rabbi Gamliel by the first opinion.
So the first opinion holds that we only allow wearing tefillin on Shabbat in the way that it's normally worn during the week. Rabban Gamliel says you can go out on a limb and do something strange in this case. That's the whole difference. Nothing to do with it. In fact, so if you now think about what we just said, the Talmud Yerushalmi in this statement here of explaining that according to Rabbanan, in other words Tanakama, it's en mahwar, and according to Rabban Gamliel it is mahwar. It's basically saying the same explanation as the Talmud Bavli. That it has something to do with the concept of Shabbat Zman Tefillin, not Zman Tefillin, right? or to what extent we understand, or for what reason we understand that Shabbat is not Zman Tefillin. In other words, there is some connection. Rabbi Levi Ginsburg, by the way, in his Chidushim over there, suggests, and this seems to me very, very reasonable indeed, that here we have what in fact we have here is a mahloket amongst latter-day Tanaim based on an ancient halacha that was stated in a more general sense, in a more general fashion. Namely, that the original halacha was that hamoset tefillin on Shabbat, etc., lovshan kedarkam, or something like that. You wear lovesh kedarkam. You do it. You wear them as you normally would. And that's exactly the discussion. The Tanakama holds, as you normally would, means one pair, because that's what you always do. And Rabban Gamliel says, normally you do, but seeing that it's mutar to wear two, even if you're being told to wear them as you normally would or normally can, that's the question. Is it as normally you would or normally can? If it's normally as you normally do, then you wear one. If it's as you normally can, if you wish to, for whatever reason, you can wear two. So here we allow two. In other words, and we see this mahlok, this concept of latter-day Chachamim differing on how to interpret an earlier statement which was stated in a more general way. We see this throughout the Mishnah. Many of the mahlokot of Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel also can be explained that way. That there was an ancient halacha which said X, Y, Z, and then Beth Hillel and Beth Shammai differed over how exactly to explain that somewhat general statement, whether it should be more specifically explained in this way or more specifically explained in the other way. So we see that even though it's definitely possible to explain and understand this Mishnah and explain the two positions in the Mishnah without reference to the concept of Shabbat Zman Tefillin or not, we see nevertheless both in the Bavli and also in the Yerushalmi, but the Yerushalmi does it in a much more, how shall I say, in a much more balanced way, I think. There is this suggestion, there is the possibility that there is some connection between these two opinions and how we define the status of Miswat Tefillin on Shabbat. The Bavli says it in a very forthright and very, you could even say perhaps extreme manner. In other words, it says it's a mahloket about whether Shabbat is Zman Tefillin or not. Tana Kama holds you do wear Tefillin on Shabbat. Rabban Gamliel says you don't wear Tefillin on Shabbat. That's how you would understand it from the Talmud Bavli. The Talmud Yerushalmi is saying it in a much more balanced, a much more carefully worded way. It says, everyone agrees you don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. The question is, what is the status of this halacha? According to the Tana Kama, it's possible that he holds all the limudim, all the limudim from the Pesukim are asmachta'of. And therefore, maybe it really is man tefillin, or you could make that argument. Not that practically you wear tefillin, but that you make the argument, you could make the argument that one might wear tefillin on Shabbat were it not for the following factors. Whereas Rabban Gamliel may hold that really no, there's no real room for such interpretation. That really it's considered davar muhlat, davar mahuwa, davar min haTorah, that Shabbat is not zman tefillin, and this can also perhaps be used to explain as a way of interpreting these two opinions. But in essence, we see that, and by the way, of course, if you follow the path of the Yerushalmi, you don't run into that brick wall, that problem that we had before, where the Rambam tells us in his Pirush on the Mishnah that the machloket here is dependent on the question of Shabbat Zman Tefillin, and then telling us halacha is not like Rabban Gamliel, which flies in the face of the other halacha that Shabbat is not Zman Tefillin. If you say that the Ma'aseh, everyone agrees you don't wear tefillin, that's not the issue. No one says you wear tefillin, because there's not a single Tana who ever says such a thing. Rather, the question is why we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. And that may have some influence on the question of one pair or two pairs. That's a different thing altogether, you understand? There's no room for the kusha, therefore falls away. Alright, to sum up what we saw here. We saw that this sugya, which is a very fascinating sugya in and of itself, was mentioned by some Rishonim as being a possible proof why tefillin should be worn on Hol HaMoed. What's the connection to Hol HaMoed? The connection is, if you can claim that there are Tanaim who hold that Shabbat is Zman Tefillin, and again, we're not in the Yerushalmi sense of it being possible to understand the Torah in that way, but in practically halacha l'maaseh you wear tefillin on Shabbat and Hol HaMoed. On Shabbat and Yom Tov. If you can claim there are Tanaim who hold this, then you can explain why they would also hold. It would follow, therefore, Vadai Kal Vahomer, that you wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. If you wear on Shabbat, then Vadai you wear on Hol HaMoed. And everyone would agree to that. That Hol HaMoed is less than Shabbat and less than Yom Tov. So if you wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov, Vadai you wear on Hol HaMoed. The reason that some Rishonim, like the Rashba, wished to utilize this sugyan eruvin was because this allowed them to say that the sugyan mu'id katan is according to the view of Rabbi, as posited by the Talmud Bavli, that according to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Shabbat and Shabbat azman tefillin, Shabbat and Yom Tov azman tefillin, and therefore Hol HaMoed is also azman tefillin. So therefore, in the Gemara, the Mishnah, Hol HaMoed implies almost explicitly that one wears tefillin on Hol HaMoed, and therefore one can write tefillin on Hol HaMoed in order to wear them, because you haven't got tefillin to wear, either for yourself or for someone else who hasn't got tefillin to wear. Then you can turn around and say, Nachon, that's true. According to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, we say this, but the halacha is not so. That would also, by the way, require you to change the halacha regarding, or to interpret the halacha differently regarding writing tefillin on Hol HaMoed, which is also true, by the way. The Ra'avad who also holds that you do not wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, says what it says in the Mishnah in Moed Katan about writing tefillin during Hol HaMoed is correct, but it's not because you wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. You can't deny the simple fact that the Mishnah states in Moed Katan that you can write tefillin on Hol HaMoed for yourself, or as Yerushalmi explains, or for someone else who hasn't got. But you can explain, at least in theory, that the Mishnah says this not because you're going to wear them now on Hol HaMoed, but because you need to wear them the day after the Chag is over. You're not going to have time after the Chag until the next morning to write tefillin and write them and put them in the box and sew them up, and so that's too much involved there. It's unlikely you'll manage all that at night. But if one, having examined the Sugya and Eruvin and having seen that really the Talmud Bavli does not succeed in proving that there is any Tana who holds that Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin, certainly not Halacha Ma'aseh, but even in theory, and seeing that we know from all the Tanaic sources, from all the Beraitoth quoted by in the Mechilta, both Mechiltoth in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, we see that no one holds that Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin. It becomes much less tenable to make that claim regarding the Mishnah in Moed Katan. In other words, an objective assessment of the Mishnah in Moed Katan seems to be a very powerful indication that tefillin are worn on Hol HaMoed. Yerushalmi is even more clear on this than the Bavli, perhaps. Which is why many Rishonim, we mentioned already the Rosh, we mentioned the Ozarua, and I'll add now that the Ritba, who's from Sfarad, which is relevant to our discussion, both in Eruvin and in Moed Katan, in his Hidushim, says that he thinks that this proof from Moed Katan is powerful and clear, that one wears tefillin on Hol HaMoed, and that's his position, Halacha L'Maaseh. If we agree that the Sugya and Eruvin in the Bavli does not really successfully demonstrate that there are any Tanaim who hold Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin, as Rabbeinu Hanayel points out, that we still don't know if there's such a Tana. And we see in the Yerushalmi, by the way, that there's also no mention of such an opinion, really. And the thought, the Svara mentioned in the Yerushalmi was that Vadai L'Ma'aseh we don't wear Tefillin on Shabbat, and therefore that could certainly not be used as any indication at all what you might do on Hol HaMoed. But it might be there's a difference in opinion as to the essential reason and the foundation of this halacha, why we do not wear tefillin on Shabbat, and that may be an explanation in some way that may help us to interpret the Machloket Tana Kama and Rabban Gamliel. Even though, as we saw, that's also actually not necessary, but it may be a further explanation. Adding all these things up, we see that in Hazal, that is to say, in the Mishnah, in the Tosefta, and all the Beraitoth that we have in both Talmudim, there is not the slightest indication that tefillin should be worn on Hol HaMoed. We do not find this. What did I say?
Should be worn.
We do not find any indication that tefillin should not be worn on Hol HaMoed. Thank you. If it wasn't clear, I say it again. There's no indication whatsoever that tefillin should not be worn on Hol HaMoed. In fact, there are many indications that you do wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. It's beyond all doubt that the essential issue, the deciding factor that caused certain Hachamim already in the time of the Rishonim to have some doubts as to whether one should wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, or to have no doubts and to say one should definitely not. The only factor really was an opinion which was based on Kabbalistic and mystical reasoning that one should not, that it's not proper to wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, as expressed very clearly, unequivocally, unambiguously, and vehemently in the Zohar Hadash on Ruth, where it says that it's a terrible thing indeed to wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. historically, what were the realities? In the Tosafot, I didn't mention, I'll just mention it briefly now. In the Tosafot in Eruvin, we find that the Tosafot make it clear that the reality in Ashkenaz, in France, in Germany, was to wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. Because the Tosafot discuss, this is on Daf Sadi Waw Amud Aleph, the first Tosafot, Yamim, Dibur Mathil Yamim. The Tosafot discuss whether one should wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed or not. And they quote they mention that the Halachot Gedolot says that one should not wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, which, by the way, in most versions of the Halachot Gedolot does not appear. But we do have it in one version where there is such a statement, although it's brought in the name of an anonymous Chacham called Rabbi Yaakov Bar-Haviv. And then the Tosafot quote the Yerushalmi in Moed Katan, etc. And at the end of the Tosafot it says, V'chen Amad Devar. What's V'chen Amad Devar mean? The third line from the end of the Tosafot, which means that is the practice. That's what people do. People wear tefillin. So in other words, if you want to know historically what was going on, in Ashkenaz and Tzarfat, it's clear that the practice was to wear tefillin, even though Rabbeinu Yitzhak Bala Tosafot was apparently doubtful. It wasn't clear to him, or maybe he even felt that one should not wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, although in fact we have contradictory statements as to what he actually thought. But later Balei Tosafot, like Rabbeinu Shimshon and Rabbeinu Yehuda, and later the Ozarua and the Marami Rotenburg and the Rosh, and in other words, the vast majority of all the and the Hagoth Maimoniot mentions this in the name of other Rishonim as we quoted, as we mentioned. In this book here I have in front of me, he sums up things very in a very helpful manner. Let me just quote the list of people. We have the Sefer HaTeruma from Rabbeinu Baruch, one of the Chachamim in Ashkenaz. We have the Ozarua that we mentioned. We have the Tosafot that we just mentioned now in Eruvin. So that Halacha L'Maaseh say that you should wear tefillin. We have the Hagoth Maimoniot who say V'chen hinhiru kol rabothenu, all the Chachamim, in other words, the vast majority, all say to wear tefillin Hol HaMoed. This is in Ashkenaz. This is also quoted by Arugat HaBosim, who was a Talmid of Rabbi Elazar Bala Rokeach, who says not to wear. To wear on Hol HaMoed. In other words, the reality in France and Germany, in Ashkenaz and Tzarfat, was clearly, historically, people were always wearing tefillin, even after Rabbeinu Yitzhak Bala Tosafot, one of the early Balei Tosafot, expressed some doubt. The fact was, it remained the custom, remained the practice of all the Ashkenazim to wear tefillin, to the extent that we see in the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Lamed Aleph in Hol HaMoed, that the Ramah says we do wear tefillin. He writes very explicitly that in all our areas, in other words, all of Europe, all the Ashkenazim, they all wear tefillin. So if you were to go back 500 years or even less, 400 years, you would discover, even 300 years ago, you would have discovered that all the Ashkenazim were wearing tefillin on Hol HaMoed. Amongst the Ashkenazim, this began to slowly change in certain parts of the Ashkenazi world, only because of the advent of Hasidut. Because Hasidut is, of course, based on Kabbalah and the Zohar, and if the Zohar says not to wear tefillin, so of course the Hasidim began ceasing to wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, and that practice began to spread as Hasidut spread. But even having said that, all those who were not officially and completely Hasidim continued to wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. Down to the present day, this is still the case in many places in the world. Although it's true that just as Kabbalah and the Zohar and Hasidut have spread throughout the world and have had a major impact on the Jewish world, in the same way and to the same extent, tefillin are being worn less and less over the last few generations, we see this trend as opposed to the past. However, it's clear that in the Ashkenazim always wore tefillin, always held that way, halakha l'maaseh. Regarding Spain, the situation is much more complex, because there is this version of the Halachot Gedolot that quotes an opinion that you do not wear tefillin Hol HaMoed, and such an opinion is quoted by it's called the Sefer of Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. They're quoted by the Rosh, the Sefer Ha'itim, where it quotes in the name of a Gaon, an anonymous Gaon, that you don't wear tefillin Hol HaMoed. The Rosh also quoted this, if you recall, and he rejected it. But there is such a quote there. As a result of this opinion, which is not backed up by any clear source in Chazal, it seems that in Spain, at least part of the Jews, some of the Jews in Spain were not wearing tefillin already for a long time, a long time before the Zohar. In other words, what the Zohar was doing, this is important to understand, if one understands that the Zohar came into existence in the latter part of the 13th century, according to the Christian calendar. The Zohar, as with almost everything in such discussions which relate to halachic practice, the Zohar was not expressing a new opinion. It was simply coming to be machriya, to decide an issue that had been debated for a long time, and lay down the law. We are going to decide this way. In other words, the idea was not new that tefillin should not be worn on Hol HaMoed in Sfarad. It was not new. There were such opinions, and had been such opinions for hundreds of years. But the Zohar did come along to end the discussion. So that's why we find the Rashba in Spain saying that we don't wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. However, as I just mentioned to you, the Ran and the Ritba, who also is from Sfarad, the generation after the Rashba, say that you should wear tefillin. In other words, in Spain the issue had not really been decided, and none of them say that the Ritba doesn't say, well, all the Jews in Sfarad don't wear tefillin, so I've got a problem. I don't know what to say. It doesn't say that. It's clear that the issue was really still being debated by the Chachamim in Spain. Some apparently were, and some apparently were not. The Meiri, who lived in Provence, also writes that B'Sfarad Nahagu Shilo lahaniach. So he says in Moed Katan. But apparently in Spain the issue was really not so one-sided. Apparently there were still opinions, because we see that the Ritba and the Ran were of the opinion that one should wear tefillin Hol HaMoed. And then what happened was, this explains what happened in Spain historically. What happened was the Rosh arrived in Spain. The Rosh arrived in Spain. The Rashba was still alive. We're talking about the generation still before the Ritba and the Ran, really. And the Rosh had a very major impact, despite the fact he was an Ashkenazi, Gamur. He had a very major impact on what went on in Spain, because the Jews in Spain and the Chachamim in Spain also recognized the Rosh as a tremendous Chacham and a tremendous halachic authority, and he had a very major and he was very well accepted by the people in Spain. So much so that we have clear, documented sources that tell us that there are many communities in Spain that officially took upon themselves to accept all the psakim of the Rosh and act in accordance with the Rosh. In other words, the Rosh was their posek. This is actually a much more earth-shattering event than you may at first appreciate. For Sfaradim, who had always been noheg like the Rif and the Rambam, to come along and say, we are now going to accept the opinions of the Rosh, who's Ashkenazi, who just moved here recently, and we're now going to do exactly what the Rosh says on everything. That's a major event in halachic history. And this situation, and the Rosh was able also to teach quite a number of Talmidim in Sfarad during his lifetime, so that after his time also, first of all, he had his son, Rabbeinu Yaakov Balaturim, who wrote this tremendous Sefer Halacha called the Turim, Sefer Tur, Arba Turim, which became a halachic standard handbook of halacha for both Chachamim and simple people, because it was written in such a clear and user-friendly style that it became an immediate bestseller throughout the world. This was the first Sefer Halakha. This is very important to understand. The Arba Turim was the first halachic text, I think, in history that was a bestseller and considered a very major halachic authority throughout the Jewish world. In Ashkenaz, in Tzarfat, and in Spain, and later in North Africa.
What year around?
We're talking about the mid to late 1300s. As opposed to what had been previously the case, where the Rambam had immediately been accepted by all the Sephardi world, or almost all the Sephardi world, the Rif also, whereas in Ashkenaz there was the Balei Tosafot and the Rosh, etc. And Rami Rothenburg, you never had a posek or a book that was readily embraced by almost all the Jews on earth. The Torah was such a book. I think it was the first such book. And on this issue, for example, as the Rosh, the Torah says Mufurash that you wear Tefillin or Hol HaMoed. The result of all this was that in Spain there was now a trend from the time of the Rosh onwards. The trend began to shift in the opposite direction, away from not wearing Tefillin and towards wearing Tefillin. And that's exactly what happened from the time of the Rosh, shall we say, the early to mid 1300s. Onwards, in Spain, things began to move in that direction, that more and more Jews in Spain were wearing Tefillin or Hol HaMoed because of the influence of the Rosh and the Balei Turim and other Talmidim of the Rosh. Although it's not true that it's everywhere in Spain this was the case, certainly not immediately, and it took a long time, but over the next century or so, this began to be the common practice in most parts of Spain, to the extent that Rabbi Yitzhak Abu Hav, who was at the end of the 14th century, the end of the 1300s in Spain, what does he write? He writes, Hol HaMoed yesh de mevarchim u'yesh she'en mevarchim alehim. There are those who say a bracha when they put on tefillin or Hol HaMoed, and those who don't. That means everyone's doing it. Everyone's putting on tefillin. This is in Spain. The question was whether you make a bracha or not. But wearing tefillin, everyone was doing. This is written Furash in a book called Shohana Panim, which we only have parts of, that were printed in more recent times. But Rabbi Yitzhak Abu Hav is a very famous Chacham from Spain. So what can we understand from all this? That from the apparently the late 1300s and into the 1400s, the 15th century was really the turning point in Spain, because the Zohar comes from Spain. That's where it was written. And even those who don't wish to accept that or agree with that statement, they would definitely admit to the fact that that's where it was first published, and even they would probably also admit edited, but certainly it was first revealed in Spain. There's no question, no doubt, no argument about that. In Spain, the Zohar began to receive a kind of canonical status in the 1400s. In other words, it began to become considered a book of tremendous authority. Not in Ashkenaz, but in Spain definitely yes. And then the trend that had been the upswing in the wearing of tefillin in Spain during the 1300s. Now if you're talking about now the 1400s, this begins to wane. This upsurge begins to wane and begins to go downhill again. In other words, because of the influence of the Zohar, which is completely opposed, at least that particular section of the Zohar is opposed to wearing tefillin. Therefore, the practice began to move in the other direction of not wearing tefillin. This is exactly how we find Rabbi Yitzhak Karo, who was the uncle of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and Rabbi Yosef Karo himself, both writing. They both speak in very unequivocal terms about the fact that everyone was wearing tefillin in Spain. Everyone was wearing tefillin until they found the Sefer Zohar. In other words, they're explicitly telling you what happened. That in the 1400s, in other words, which was closer to their own time, by this time, the vast majority of Jews in Spain had had become used to wearing tefillin on Hol HaMoed, and then the Sefer Hazar began to kick in, so to speak. The influence of the Sefer Hazar began to become more and more widespread because the influence of the Mekubalim in Spain became more and more widespread, and they were quoting the Zohar, of course, and telling people that if you wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, you have mitha, etc. And this is a very efficient and
You would say it was done by force?
I don't know what you mean by force, but when you scare people into doing something, there's a certain element of coercion. I remember hearing once a certain young lady on the radio here in Israel explaining why she was Chazeh B'Tshuva. She was a Chiloniya, and she went to some Shiur of Rav Yitzchak, Anon Yitzchak, and he explained in great detail how hot it was in hell, and she got very scared and decided to do Teshuvah. That was her explanation. A very simple young woman, not an intellectual giant, and very easily influenced by such threats and by such talk. So she didn't want to be. She said explicitly. She said, "I didn't want to become frum. I didn't want to do this, but I was very scared." In the same way, if you tell people that wearing tefillin on Hol HaMoed is a terrible sin, well, a lot of people will take your word at face value and will start wearing tefillin. Why should I get involved in such a terrible sin? Especially since some people tell me it's not a miswah bichlal. So I'll play safe. This is what happened in Spain. So that by the time that Rabbi Yitzhak Karo and Rabbi Yosef Karo come along and tell us, in the generations leading up to the Gerush from Sfarad, the expulsion, the Spanish, the period of the Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion from Spain, the reality some time before that had been that all Jews or most Jews were wearing tefillin, and then this began to change because of the influence of the Zohar. And Rabbi Yitzchak Karo and Rabbi Yosef Karo make no bones about it. They say explicitly that it was the influence of the Sefer Hazar that brought this about. That's what happened in Spain. From that time and down to the present day, Sfaradim ceased wearing tefillin. Gradually, obviously these things take some time, a generation or two or three or four, but from that period, from approximately 500, 150 or so years ago, Sfaradim ceased to wear tefillin. And that's exactly the reality reflected in the Shulchan Aruch. The Mahaber, Rabbi Yosef Karo says, you must not wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, and he explicitly writes, as we quoted in previous Shiurim, he explicitly writes in the Beit Yosef that seeing this halacha is unclear amongst the poskim and from the Talmud, which is really not correct, as we saw. It's not at all unclear. But as he writes, because it's not so clear, who will dare to go against the explicit words of Rashbi in the Zohar that it's very wrong to wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, and therefore you mustn't wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. So says Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch, because he's also reflecting the reality that existed in his day already in Spain, even though he admits himself that was a turnaround compared to what had been the case some generations before. In Europe, the Ramah tells you the opposite. We all wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, even though there are those who say the bracha quietly, which is an interesting concept, saying a bracha quietly, but that's what it says. But everyone wears tefillin, and in fact even says a bracha on tefillin. The other interesting country to mention briefly is Italy. Italy was always a reality unto itself. In Italy, it's also clear that initially they were all wearing tefillin, because in many ways they were more like the Ashkenazim, and it's clear to me, based on everything that we've discussed, that was the ancient reality in Am Yisrael also, as we see from the Mishnah already in Moed Katan, that people were wearing tefillin on Hol HaMoed. And again, because of the influence of the Kabbalah and the Zohar in Italy, where there was the influence of the Zohar and the Kabbalah in Italy already in the 1500s and certainly in the 1600s was quite strong, much more so than in Europe. It was only much later in Europe, because of the advent of Hasidut, that it became more common. This influence became more widespread amongst the Ashkenazim. But in Italy, it took hold much earlier. And there we find in Italy all kinds of machlokoth, all kinds of very harif statements, very sharp statements by different chachamim, one against the other in Italy, whether one should or one should not wear tefillin Hol HaMoed, and why are you telling people they should, and also why are you telling people they should, etc. We hear of one case, for example. This is referring to the Yeshin Mem Aleph, 1581. There was a community there in Italy, and for historical reasons, it was true that in this particular community in Cremona, in this community there were Sfaradim, Italkim, and Ashkenazim. There were Jews of all backgrounds, and they were all in one community, which was not so common in those days, but there was such a thing here. The Rav of the community, his name was Rabbi Avraham Menachem HaKohen Rapa Miporto. If that sounds familiar to you, Rapa Miporto, that's exactly the basis of the name Rappaport. The name Rappaport comes. He's the ancestor of this family called the Rappaport family. It was clear to him that we couldn't have a situation where Sfaradim and Ashkenazim and Italkim were all down in the same shul, and some would wear tefillin, and some would not on Hol HaMoed. So he basically said to his community, he said to the Sfaradim, you should wear tefillin without a bracha, and to the Ashkenazim he said, you should continue wearing tefillin also without a bracha. In other words, everyone should do without a bracha. That way there was some kind of a compromise, and everyone would be doing the same thing and much better. This was his suggestion. Everyone accepted the suggestion except for one particular individual who made a tremendous fuss about it, and this resulted in other chachamim like the Ramami Pano writing teshuvot against this, etc. What we see clearly, and the reason this one person didn't want to accept this compromise was explicitly for Kabbalistic reasons. So the fact that you want to make a compromise doesn't detract from the fact that the Zohar says it's a terrible thing to wear tefillin. That's what he writes. This is all quoted in the sources. So there cannot be the slightest doubt that without the influence of the Zohar and the Kabbalah, there would this reality that we see today, both in Chutz La'aretz to some extent, and here in Eretz Yisrael, almost without exception, of people not wearing tefillin or Hol HaMoed, there can be no doubt that this reality would never have come into being. Even in those parts of the world like Sfarad, where there were opinions and there were communities that were not wearing tefillin in much earlier times, even there, the scales have been tipped in the favor of wearing tefillin or Hol HaMoed until the advent of the Zohar. These are the historical facts, and the facts and the statements of people like Rabbi Yosef Karo speak for themselves. As for the sources of Chazal, as we said before, there is not the slightest indication that tefillin should not be worn on Hol HaMoed, and there are many clear indications that one should. Interestingly enough, the Ramami Pano, who was a Chacham in Italy, who was also big Mekubal, and his shitan in Halakha was always to force the Halakha to accommodate itself with Kabbalah, not vice versa. He himself uses the very interesting expression that he speaks about the Zohar as being a reason of mileh da'agavta. In other words, an agadic reason for not wearing tefillin. Agadic. In other words, this is exactly the issue. Should such reasons and such modes of thought be considered acceptable methodologies when involved in halachic debate? That's really the issue here, because if we, as I said, if we remove all the agadic, that is, and Kabbalistic, because Kabbalah is a form of agadah in the sense that it's not halakha. Anything that's not halakha can be considered and should be considered a form of agadah. Anything that's not halachic does not really have a place in halachic discussion. If we remove all the agadic or Kabbalistic considerations and background in this discussion, then we find that there's really no argument at all not to wear tefillin or Hol HaMoed. I think we'll leave this debate for now. I think we've covered more or less all the angles, and now it's for every person, as we said at the beginning of the Shiur, to use his God-given faculties of reason, logic, common sense, and respect for texts to reach his own conclusion. To my mind, the conclusion is obvious. And with that, we end for today. Kol Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.